traversed thus far. So remember, we've looked at the sacrifices which God institutes for his people to draw near to them, to reintroduce the idea that they're creatures and he's the creator. We've seen the institution of the priesthood, the ordination of Aaron and his sons, to serve in the tabernacle, which is the one place in the world which has been restored to its complete purity. And we've seen the distinction between pure and impure, clean and unclean, looking forward to, once again, the restoration of the whole of creation. And then last week, remember, we took a look at the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16, the day on which atonement is made for Israel's cleansing of all her sin. And I tried to make the point that God is clearly the agent of atonement, the sole agent of atonement. And the purpose of atonement, right, is to make it possible for human beings to dwell in the holy presence of God, because otherwise they won't be able to do that. They'll end up like, remember, Nadab and Abihu, who were incinerated. Okay, we don't want to be incinerated. It's not fun. So the last part of Leviticus, Leviticus 17 through 27, is sometimes referred to as the Holiness Code. And so let me say a word about what the Holiness Code is, and then we'll start to look at it. So one of the things we have to remember here is that the Old Testament does something which is unique in the ancient world. And it's kind of hard to explain because it's so much of our mental geography. That is, it's really important to recognize that in all the religions around Israel, what happens in the sanctuary, the temple, has almost no relationship to what happens outside it. Or to put that another way, there really is no firm moral or spiritual relationship between what you do in the presence of the gods and what you do out there in the world. In Israel, and especially here in Leviticus, it's the opposite. What we're seeing in the Holiness Code is the insistence that who Israel is in the presence of God needs to be translated in a radical way into who they are in terms of everyday life. And this is what's generally called holiness. And so throughout the book of Leviticus, right, we'll hear God addressing his people. I am the Lord your God. I am holy, therefore you are to be holy as well. So this is like a totally new dynamic, okay? It's one of the things that makes Israel unique, and this then gets radicalized in Christianity, which we'll see later on. So let me say a few words about what holiness is, and maybe also what it's not. And then that'll kind of set us up for walking through part of the Holiness Code. Now, I think that one of the things that's unfortunate about kind of modern Christianity is that the word holy has almost been ruined in a pretty radical way. So if you were to, kind of poll people, I think you would probably find that most folks, even many Christians, have a sort of like a negative understanding, or the word holiness has like a negative connotation, right? So if you were to poll someone, right, you'd probably find that if you describe someone as holy, you're probably describing them as self-righteous, no fun, and walking around with a kind of an immense sense of superiority. That's probably, you'd find some version of that, right? So I think that's why I think we need to kind of put that aside for a minute and think about what holiness means in the book of Leviticus. And it's not really hard to understand. Holiness means something like this. Holiness means it's not a calling for like a special group of really like hyper-spiritual people, okay? There's no version of like, the Marines and the people of Israel, the true, the proud, the spiritual. Okay, that doesn't exist. Holiness is a call for everyone in Israel. It doesn't matter who you are. Holiness is a call that God puts out for all his people and this is the reason why. Holiness actually means living back into the original vocation that God gave to human beings, which was, right, to be the image of God. And so, and this is a really important point, in becoming holy, we don't become hyper-spiritual and arrogant and all that kind of stuff. In being holy, what actually happens is we become real human beings again. Really important. Holiness here in the book of Leviticus is about us walking back and living into our vocation as human beings. And when we do that, we become real people again, because we're not now. Okay, under sin, we are actually not real people. Okay, we're sort of like defective. It's like it's like a house here in Tallahassee that's been abandoned for like 3 years, and the electricity's been turned off, and no one's done anything to the house. Okay, and the roof is covered with mold. There's mold growing on the inside. The yard looks like a jungle. That's kind of like what we are under sin. And so now we need to kind of live back into our vocation. Well, let me just give you a brief indication about how this gets played out in the New Testament, and then we'll take a look at Leviticus 17. It's really important to remind ourselves of the fact that the New Testament continues the pattern that's set in the book of Leviticus. It's really important to see that. So let me give you 2 examples. Example 1 is sort of like the big example, and it comes from Paul's letter to the Romans. So in Romans 1 through 8, Paul spends a lot of time talking about how it is that God has brought us back into his presence through the work of Christ and through the work of the Holy Spirit. That's the subject of Romans 1 through 8. So Romans 1 through 8 is dedicated to helping us understand how it is that God has taken us, who are sinners, and has brought us back into his presence, okay? But of course, as you probably know, Romans doesn't end with chapter 8, okay? Romans 8 doesn't end with Paul saying, and they all lived happily ever after. No, because Romans goes on, and in chapters 12 to 15, Paul then has a lot to say about what this looks like in everyday life. Same pattern as Leviticus, okay? It's almost like as Paul is writing Romans, he has the book of Leviticus in front of him, because that's the pattern. So that's one example. Another example is also really nice, and I'm going to read it to you because it's brief. It comes from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. It's Ephesians 4, 17 through 24. And this gives us, I think, an insight once again into what holiness is, and also it helps us to see that Paul's still kind of following the Leviticus path. Here's what he says. Paul's been talking about how all of us are part of the body of Christ, how all of us have been given gifts to serve the body, and then he says this in Ephesians 4, 17 and following. Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart, sin. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But that is not the way you learn Christ. So notice the contrast here, right? Paul says, under sin, right, our hearts become hardened to God, okay? And under sin, right, we tell ourselves, look, God, I don't really care what your purposes are. I know what I want, and I'm going to get it. That's that kind of basic hardness of heart. So Paul says, well, no, that's not what you got, because that's not the way you learn Christ. Assuming that you have been heard about him, that you were taught in him as the truth is in Jesus. And here's what he says. To put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life, and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self," and here's the important part, "the new self, created after the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness." Notice what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, look, here's the great benefit of what Christ accomplishes, right? Christ accomplishes this sort of radical transformation whereby we are renewed after the image of God and therefore attain true righteousness and holiness. We get to be like real human beings again. Paul says that's the good news of the gospel. Okay, so just want you to see that point there, that the pattern of Leviticus is still kind of being followed in the New Testament. Let's take a look at Leviticus 17. So all the stuff that we're going to be reading about is sort of like everyday stuff, okay? And the thing that we want to get from this, I think, is that there is nothing that we do in life which is not of interest to God. That's the point, okay? There's nothing that we do as we go about our daily lives that is not of interest to God. And this, therefore, touches everything. And so we're going to take a look at a couple of subjects here. In Leviticus 17, the subject is food. Okay, that's a big concern, right? If you go into any store, right, you'll see myriads of diet things, and all kinds of things are promoted as, low fat and keto, and if you eat this, you'll live to 153, and, this sort of stuff. Of course, there's also that bumper sticker that says, eat right, exercise, diet, and then die anyway. Which is true, right, ultimately. But in Leviticus 17, we're looking at food, and more specifically, food that comes from animals. So in Leviticus 17, we're told two important things about food which comes from animals. The first is this, that whenever you are about to slaughter an animal in order to eat it, okay, so you're raising whatever, goats, oxen, sheep, and now you're about to slaughter one of the animals you're raising, what you have to do, according to Leviticus 17, is you have to take the animal to the entrance of the tabernacle, offer the animal to God, then you may kill it and then eat the animal. Now, why is this being done? And I think the answer to that question is this, right? Once again, it addresses our tendency to mindlessness. Right? It addresses our tendency to take God's blessings for granted. So every time you're going to have an animal for dinner or lunch or whatever, you're bringing it to the entrance of the tabernacle, and you are thanking God for this animal, for what you're about to eat tonight. And then you're killing the animal. You're acknowledging, right, that the animal actually has come from God. It's God's blessing to you, and this animal, right, is not simply something that you created. It's a gift from you, and also, I guess, by the way, right, you're literally being reminded that with every meal you eat, God's sustaining you through what you're eating. Okay, so this is a way of dealing with the human forgetfulness of God. This obviously gets translated in a number of ways, right? It's behind the practice of grace before a meal, right? Where we're acknowledging, I have a job, I worked, I did go to Publix, I did buy the food, I did bring it home, I did cook it, and all that's true, right? But ultimately, where did everything you're about to eat come from? It came from creation, which is not your doing. Okay? Unless you have a serious ego problem. And if you do, then we'll need to talk about that. So that's one thing. So every meal you're eating from an animal, right, you're being reminded that it's come from God. Now, another thing that pertains to the eating of animals is this, that the other thing you need to do is you may not eat the blood of the animal that you're about to slaughter and eat, because, here in Leviticus, the life of the animal is represented by its blood. And that is used for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's, as we've seen, the making of atonement. So you have to drain all the blood out. This is what's part of kosher meat, kosher slaughter, right? One of the things that's true with kosher meat is all the blood's been drained out of the animal, so there's none left. But the idea, I think, also is this, right? It's also a way of reminding us where we stand in the created order. That is, once again, while you're allowed to eat this animal is simply not there for you. It too is a creature of God, and it has a meaning and a value that's independent of you. In other words, animals are not just simply food. And so by disallowing the people of Israel from eating animal blood, they're being taught, right? Yeah, you can eat these animals, but you don't have mastery over them. They are not yours. They ultimately belong to God. And of course, right, ultimately all life belongs to God. So this is a way of making sure, right, that we understand the order of creation, okay? Yes, back in Genesis 1:28 to be exact, God gave human beings dominion over creation, but that dominion is not absolute. It is a delegated dominion and therefore a limited dominion, right? It's a dominion under God. So creation is something that we may use, but it's not just simply ours to do whatever we want with. I think there's an important lesson in that. So delegated dominion, and a theme is emerging here that we'll see that really emerges in Exodus 18 through 20, and that is, there is an order to creation which we have to recognize. There's an inherent order in creation that we have to recognize, and the problems come about when we refuse to recognize that order. We've seen some of those problems already, right? So problem number one, right? If all of life belongs to God, does anyone have the right to kill anyone else simply because they don't like them, or they're in the way, or it's convenient to get rid of them, or whatever? No. And, right, the thing that's so terrible about murder is not just simply that you've killed someone, but when you murder someone, right, basically you're telling God, hey, look, God, why don't you just butt out and let me have mastery over your creation? That's what you're saying to God. Okay, so really important point. Now, in Exodus 18 through 20, we have a number of things going on, and the central focus here is the relationships between people. This becomes obviously something God's very interested in as well. We'll see this throughout the whole Old Testament. And the first topic that pops up, as you might imagine, in chapter 18 is the subject of human sexuality. So we'll take a walk through that. Now, the first thing that I want to do before we take a look at particulars is take a look at Exodus 18, 3 through 4, and see what God says right before anything is said about sexuality. Here it is, Leviticus 18:3. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. So here's the framework for what we're about to hear. God says to the people of Israel, okay, look, remember how they lived back in Egypt? Don't follow their example. And once you get in the land of Canaan, you'll see some other kind of odd things going on. Don't follow their example either. You're not to follow, and notice this, right? Israel's leaving one great civilization, Egypt, and coming into another great civilization, the Canaanite, and they're to disregard the example of both. Okay, you are my people, and your daily lives are going to be ordered according to creation, my intentions, not what you see in these two places. That'll become more specific in just a minute. Now, another thing occurs, this is Leviticus 20, verse 6. I think this is really important, too, to get the whole context here. One of the things that, it's Leviticus 20, 26, right at the end of the chapter. It says, and this is kind of by way of summary, "You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine." So it's really important to understand here that everything we're about to hear about human sexuality, about how people are supposed to treat one another, the people of Israel are being told, look, don't look around and say, well, hey, wait a minute. They're allowed to do that in Egypt. Why can't we do it? Or, hey, this is like really popular with every Canaanite I know. You know, why can't we do it? God's telling them already, right? Look, that's not the question. The question for you is not what are most people out there doing. The question is, who are you in relationship to me? That's the fundamental question that's going to be asked. Of course, we want to remind ourselves, right? That's the fundamental question that we have to ask as Christians as well, right? It doesn't really matter what a majority of the American people think about anything. That's really not what should register for us, right? We have to kind of live by a different order. So we're getting that. So let's take a look at human sexuality. Now, I think it's really interesting to see what's going on here. And if you've read Leviticus 18, you'll notice here that we have a list. It's rather lengthy, about who you are not supposed to be having sexual relations with. Okay, and it's a negative list. You know, not this, not this, not this, not in this way, not this, not with this, not with this. Not. So so I want to offer kind of like a summary of it. So once again, we need to put on our Leviticus thinking cap for a minute and think this through so it's clear to us. And I think it looks something like this. There's a question that's sort of like under the surface of Leviticus 18 and 20, and that question is this, and it may seem like the answer to the question is obvious, but it's actually not. The question here is, well, what is sex for? That's the question that's under the surface, okay? Now here's the really important part, right? That question can be answered in a variety of ways. Right? The question, what is sex for, can be answered in a whole bunch of ways. The modern sort of 21st century Western answer to that question is, what is sex for? It's for whatever I want it to be for. Whatever happens to turn me on at any given moment, that's what it's for. The thing we're being alerted to here in Leviticus 18 and 20 is this, that God has made us sexual creatures with some very specific purposes in mind. And for us, therefore, right, we need to live into those purposes. And here's a really important part. Living into God's purposes for sexuality isn't just simply a matter of like a bunch of rules and regulations. The point here, right, is, guess what? God's the creator of sexuality. Therefore, you know what? He probably knows something about it. And he also probably knows how that is going to make us most happy and most human. So you know what? God just may know something about all this. Okay? So let's take a look at that. What does God know about human sexuality? Well, in Leviticus 18 and 20, I think we learn three things about God's purposes for human sexuality. Purpose number one, as God's designed it, human sexuality is fundamentally heterosexual. It's about the relationship between the two human beings who kind of represent different inflections of one human nature, man and woman. That is, human sexuality is fundamentally heterosexual because it represents the coming together of these two slightly different human beings. And this will become, we'll see some more of this purpose in just a minute, but that's the idea. And this idea, of course, is first introduced in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, right? And then we get it again in Genesis 2, the famous passage that's included in the prayer book for the marriage liturgy. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the idea. So on one hand, right, human sexuality is fundamentally heterosexual. It's about the orientation of man to woman and woman to man. That's God's intention. Second, human sexuality is fundamentally marital. There's no thought anywhere in the Bible or in the larger part of the Christian tradition that sexual relations would take place outside of marriage, for the simple reason that the sexual relationship between husband and wife is actually the sign of the marriage relationship. Okay? So let me use a somewhat homey analogy to illustrate this point. For Leviticus here, sexual relations outside of marriage would be somewhat like me inviting myself to your Thanksgiving dinner. Okay, so it's Thanksgiving Day, all your relatives are gathered around your dining room, there's a knock at the door, it's me. I show up uninvited, and I say, okay, when are we having dinner? What are we having? And of course, the first thought that comes into your mind is, why on earth are you here? Right? I don't have any right to be there, right? I'm not part of your family. You didn't invite me. I'm an uninvited guest. I don't belong. Same deal here, right? The idea here is that the sexual relationship between husband and wife actually is the sign of their marital relationship, okay? So that's why human sexuality is both heterosexual and marital. And then finally, one third thing, it follows from the first two. The other third thing about human sexuality is it's fundamentally procreative. That is, one of the purposes of human sexuality is to produce new life. It's productive of new life. And that purpose can't be denied it, okay? And this is where we've gotten into a lot of trouble in our society because we've wanted to separate sexuality from procreation. And hence now we have this whole regimen of all kinds of things, which of course now includes various forms of abortion, right? Because now we've made this rather radical separation between sexuality and procreation. We've also separated sexuality from marriage. And so now we've actually gotten to the point where in our culture, right, the procreative aspect of marriage is now sort of looked upon with a sense of fear. And now it's legitimate, right, to end that in any way, shape, or form. And so once again, the idea right here is that by departing from God's intentions and purposes, right, we're actually not making ourselves more happy, but actually less. Okay, so fundamental fact that we know from all manner of sociological research and whatnot, right? From all that we know, right, and I'm sure those of you who are counselors will know more about this than I do, but from everything we know, right, the people who find sexuality the most fulfilling, the most humanizing, right, are couples who've been married for a long time. Right? So once again, right, God actually knows something about sexuality. Surprise, surprise, right? Because he created. So these are God's kind of like fundamental purposes. And so the idea here, right here, is that means that God's people, right, need to realize that these are God's purposes and then to live into them. Okay? And once again, these purposes are actually for our benefit. Okay? It's not like God saying sort of like arbitrarily, okay, human sexuality will be heterosexual. You got any problems with that? That's not it, right? It's that God knows how he's created us, and he also knows that, men were meant for women and women were meant for men. That's how we are going to be the most happy. Okay, so that's the idea here. So that's sexuality in a nutshell. Let me start to say a couple things about Leviticus 19. Oh, by the way, one other thing that's in Leviticus 18 is a prohibition in Leviticus 18:21 of sacrificing children to the god Moloch. So let me say a brief word about that because I think it's significant and it tells us some important things. So one of the things we know about Canaanite religion is the Canaanites sacrificed or tended to sacrifice a firstborn son to the god Moloch, M-O-L-E-C-H. And it was generally done by having like this big fire pit, and after saying a series of prayers, you'd literally take the male baby and throw the baby into the fire pit, and the baby would be burned up and then sacrificed to the god. And the idea behind this awful practice was essentially this: by giving Moloch something that's really valuable to you, that would be sort of like a really good way of getting Moloch to think well of you and bestowing some blessing. Okay, so it's like, you take your firstborn son, obviously really valuable, and you're sacrificing this child to Moloch, and then that kind of gives Moloch a good impression of who you are, and then Moloch maybe might then bless you. So we just want to remember, right, that this practice isn't just, an isolated practice that's, engaged in by a group of kooks. This is a societal practice engaged by a whole society and a whole culture, which is endeavoring to get blessings from the god Moloch. So this is explicitly forbidden by God. Those of you who've read the Old Testament will know that God forbidding it doesn't necessarily mean that something doesn't happen. And so Israel will actually struggle with this for a long time. But that's for a later story. The point is this. The point that God is making, right, is that human sacrifice should not happen among the people of Israel. For two reasons, and we want to be clear about what those reasons are. Reason number one is you don't need to offer God things to get his favor because you already have it. That's what the covenant means, right? The people of Israel have God's favor literally before they even asked for it. Okay. Remember, back in Exodus, God doesn't say to the people of Israel, look, if you're all good boys and girls, I'll free you from Egypt. Okay, I'm going to watch you for 6 weeks, and if you're all really righteous and really holy and say your prayers right, I'll free you from Egypt. God frees the people from Egypt without asking them. Okay, so that's the first point here, right? You don't need to sacrifice your children to God because you already have his blessing. You don't need to earn it. The other thing that's going on here too, I think, is God is beginning to teach his people about the value of human life. And in some ways, I think, I know that it's popular today to sort of, bash the church about all the mistakes we've made and how somehow, right, the church is somehow at the bottom of all society's ills, right? We've destroyed the environment and done all kinds of stuff. It's really important to understand here, right, that this sort of basic notion that there's kind of like an inherent dignity that inheres in each person. This is a notion that's given to us, first in the Old Testament, and then it gets magnified in Christianity because, right, guess what happens? God himself becomes a human being. And this is a way of this is a way of God sort of like beginning to teach his people, right, that human life, right, is something that has an inherent value. And so one of the things we'll want to notice here next week when we look at chapter 19, which is about human relationships, we'll notice that God specifically tells his people that there are certain things that they are not to do to one another. And also, by the way, they're not to do those things to the sojourner among them. That is, in effect, right, you have to treat the non-Israelite among you in the same way that you treat the Israelite. And the reason why that's the case, right, is because it's not just whether you're a non-Israelite or an Israelite, or whether you come from a wealthy family or a poor family, or you went to this school or didn't go to that school. All that's irrelevant. The thing is that by virtue of being a human creature, you possess an inherent value and worth. And so one of the things that we'll see here is that gets spread out to all different kinds of people. It gets spread out to the aged and infirm who can no longer work, right? Who are no longer contributing members of society, but who don't lose their value. It's also true for the poor. And we'll find this is true for. So what we'll see is we'll see the Holiness Code, right, protecting various kinds of people who, for one reason or another, are weak and who are vulnerable. But it goes back to this idea of human life possessing a kind of inherent worth or value that comes from God, not from our recognition. Okay, so that's really important. And with that, I'll need to stop or I'm going to get run over by a procession.